So hello and welcome to the Varsity Tutors StarCourse series, where we're back with another event in our college prep summer. You guys may have been around for some of our test prep events, for some of our events with Harvard admissions officer Deborah Duran. Here we have Joanna Graham. She's been on the Georgetown Board of Regents. She's an admissions interviewer all throughout the world of admissions. And as I'm always aware when getting started on one of these events, you only get a little bit of time to make an impression on people and kind of get your point across of who you are and what value you have to deliver. Well, that's what today is all about, whether it's college applications, job interviews, any of those kind of things. Your personal brand really matters. Being intentional about what message do you want to send, how will you get that message across, because you only get people's attention for a certain amount of time. And Joanna's an expert on that as a marketing executive, as an admissions consultant, and someone who's worked in high-level college admissions herself. And she's going to tell us all about how to build and get across our personal brands. Couple other quick things before I turn it over here. One, like I said, this is part of an entire summer worth of events here at Varsity Tutors. If you're Varsity Tutors Learning members, you've also got small group classes on writing your college application essays, on choosing colleges, financial aid, obviously test prep, and all those kind of things. So we hope you guys will take advantage of all of those kind of things. Joanna will be back a little bit later in the summer. Devery's back next week with more events. So this is part of a whole series. If you enjoy it, tell your friends, become a Varsity Tutors Learning member so you can get even deeper with all those kind of things. And then with the chat, we're going to try to keep it as interactive as possible today. So please, if you have questions, comments, Joanna's going to ask you guys some questions, pop those in the chat. We'll probably get to most of your questions toward the end. Don't hesitate to ask them, but my job is I'll keep track of most of the questions and get those answered. But please keep it interactive, because Joanna's going to ask you for some thoughts about your own brands, and we want to hear from you. So with all that said, let me turn it over to your teacher for today, Joanna Graham, admissions expert extraordinaire, and she's going to talk about building your brand for college admissions and beyond.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you all are joining from. As Brian mentioned, my name is Joanna Graham. I'm coming to you live from Northern Virginia. I'm just right outside of Washington, D.C., so it is 3 o'clock on this lovely Monday afternoon. I would love to get a sense of where folks are dialing in from and what year you are in school, or if you're a parent, what grade your child is going into. So feel free to start populating the chat. I love virtual because it obviously gets to, it gets the word out, and we get a much broader, more diverse audience. But I'll be honest, I have a love-hate relationship with just staring at myself for the next hour. So, all right, I see the chat is going crazy, and I will leave it to Brian to help MC.
You gave me the hardest job. People are from everywhere. It looks like we've got everything from even 6th, 7th grade all the way through lots of rising seniors. We've got most of the U.S. covered, even some Canada. I just saw Alberta in there. So yeah, people Fantastic. All across the board. I've got to figure we've got probably 40 states covered, and
Fantastic.
Grade and 12.
Fantastic. Well, I will be the first to say, I know you mentioned a couple of middle schoolers. So I will say this talk is definitely geared a little bit more towards high schoolers. But if there are some specific questions you have around middle school, again, definitely feel free to pop those in the chats. And we can certainly, and I'll be honest, I think a lot of the guidance that will be applicable to our freshmen and sophomores, there's definitely going to be some, it'll definitely be applicable to some of our middle schoolers as well. But let's see, go ahead and keep populating the chat. Again, would love to hear where folks are from. And then also, if there are things that you're looking to gain from today's session, or if you have any specific questions, again, start dropping those in the chat, and Brian will collect those for a little bit later. So I'm going to dive right in and start talking to you all a little bit about me. So what would a personal branding session be without just a little bit of background on me? And I will be the first to tell you, my personal brand has really evolved a lot over the years. I've been in the nonprofit. I've worked in the nonprofit world as a marketing and product executive. I spent almost a decade at the Graduate Management and Admission Council, which is the nonprofit that develops and delivers the GMAT exam. I've also headed up product marketing in the ed tech world, as well as I've dabbled a little bit in the Web3 space. And so when you think about sort of my professional brand, it's a little bit I'll be honest, it's a little all over the map, and I've had to constantly sort of rebuild and evolve it. But when you think a little bit also about your personal brand, or when I think about my personal brand, I am a St. Louis native. So I don't know if we have any Midwesterners here. I know Varsity Tutors is technically headquartered in St. Louis. So yay, rah, go Midwest. And I am a Georgetown alum, as Brian mentioned as well. I did my undergrad at Georgetown, was fortunate enough to read applications at Georgetown for a couple of years and have stayed super active. So Hoya Saxa there. And I also married into the military almost 20 years ago. So in many ways, my personal brand, I identify very much with being a military spouse, as well as a supporter of military families. So I don't know if we have any military kids or military spouses on the line as well, but welcome if you are here. You're in great company. And then finally, I'm, in my free time, what little free time I do have, I really love endurance athletics. So I've actually run over 40 marathons and a couple of Ironman triathlons as well. And so a big part of my personal brand has to do with health and wellness and fitness. And so I share that just to, number one, give you a little bit of a peek into the type of person I am and the way that I choose to spend my time, but also to sort of share, when you think about personal branding and what your story really is, it's number one, it's going to change and evolve over time, as you will quickly see. But number two, depending on the type of environment you're in, what job you're applying for, what activities you're pursuing, the way that you present yourself, the way that you tell your story is going to evolve as well. So let's start with a pop quiz here. And actually, I promise there's not really a right or wrong answer here, but what is a brand? So again, would love to hear your thoughts in the chat. And specifically, when you think about a brand, what are some of your favorite or most memorable brands? So I've got a couple of logos, a couple of names up here just to get the creative juices flowing, but would love to hear from folks. What are some of the brands that you think of when you think of memorable brands? And I will give you a hint here. Remember, brands are not commercials or taglines either. So.
Joanna, my brand is guy who monitors the chat, so you don't have to get distracted while you're presenting. Got a lot of people like Nike came up a lot. Apple has come up a decent amount. Lululemon, Google. Somebody said Varsity Tutors. Thank you very much. Technically, I'm on the marketing team, so I'm going to ask for a promotion with that one. We've got Tesla in there. A couple people talking about, what is a brand? It's sort of what's recognizable. It's a quick summary of the value you offer. Something that companies call themselves or try to put out in the world. Coca-Cola's in there.
Awesome.
Inter Miami, I think Messi is already impacting the brand. And yeah, we can turn it back to you with some great answers, everybody.
Awesome. No, that's fantastic. And those are all, and you all have named some phenomenal brands. And obviously you probably see some of them like Apple and Coca-Cola represented here. And I think when you think about brands, I think the biggest thing when you're thinking about brands, number one is, like I said, brands they're not commercials, they're not taglines, they're not even necessarily logos. But what a really good brand or what a memorable brand does is it causes you to feel a certain way. So if you're someone working at Apple, if you're someone working at Coca-Cola, you know that you're doing your job well if you are eliciting a certain response or a certain emotion from the consumer. And that's really what good brands do. So now let's take it a step further. And I don't know if we have any parents on the line. I don't know how much this will apply to our high schoolers or our middle schoolers, but would love to just get people's thoughts. So when you see this, what do you see, and more importantly, what do you feel? Like, how does this image make you all feel? If you are anyone who has young children at home, like myself, I look at something like this and, little angels start singing and halos go off because my day does not start off without one of these. So
we've got awake, tired, which is cool that we got some opposites in there. Morning, relaxed, thirsty. We also are starting to find a debate going on. The first couple of responses were Starbucks, but Dunkin' Donuts is coming in. Somebody mentioned bitter taste, energy. Nice. Lots of awake, lots of just coffee, the word coffee coming up a lot, hot, refreshing, unhealthy pre-workout. Joanna's mentioned athleticism in there. Caffeine came up a few times. Gross, nice. I don't like talking, a lot of bitter in there. So yeah, some really great answers.
Awesome. That's great. And, and again, I think this example is great because, as I said before, brands aren't necessarily about logos or taglines, but it's about the way something makes you feel. So now we're going to take this one step further. And I'd be curious about what happens with our Starbucks Duncan debate. And I don't know if we've got any folks up from the West Coast, from San Francisco, if there's like a vote for Blue Bottle, or I know Brian, you said we have someone from Alberta, so maybe there's like a vote for Tim Hortons up there too somewhere. But would love to hear what folks think now when you do slap a logo on there. Now, what do people think?
All right, answers are starting to come in. Ooh, expensive a lot of times here. Familiar and known, expensive, fancy, overpriced, pricey, trusted company, good, sweeter, trustable, exquisite, worse than Tim's. I think, yeah, and that doesn't have to be Alberta. I think, I was in Detroit as a kid. We had that too. Popular, yeah, popular, famous, fad, popular for some reason, suspicious, important. So yeah, really, really good answers coming in. I think probably what's important to say is there have been, hundreds of these answers coming in really quickly. So people definitely have an opinion.
Fantastic. And you know what, though, that, like I said, that's sort of the gut test right there. Like that's your litmus test for whether or not a brand is doing its job. Because again, for better or worse, good brands are going to affect how you feel about something. And good brands then take that feeling to try to motivate customers and consumers to achieve various business goals. And so, I think Starbucks is a great example here. Again, we could have used Dunkin' Donuts, we could have used Blue Bottle, we could have used Tim Hortons. Starbucks, I find that it's usually a little more polarizing because people have fallen into a couple of different camps on the coffee front. But at the end of the day, it's going to elicit some type of response, and especially for folks who responded with words that sort of evoked various emotions. So everything from, awake to even things like, expensive or fancy, it's eliciting a very sort of visceral response. And again, for better or worse, that's what good brands are going to do. So let's move on. Oops, sorry, my mouse got a little excited. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about some other brands and those different types of sentiments. So you'll see a bunch of different brands up here and a bunch of different logos and how they're sort of segmented into different buckets with regards to sentiment. And so chances are you probably recognize a handful of these up here. Maybe you might recognize all of these. And these are really, if you were the marketing person, at Disney or Coca-Cola or at Intel or Microsoft, for example, ultimately, these are the types of emotions or the sentiment that you're trying to get people to associate with your brand. And again, some brands do a better job than others, but the ones who are, the ones who really are doing a good job at sort of making things memorable are the ones who, just like that, who evoke that response when you just see the logo. Again, you don't need a commercial. You don't necessarily need much more beyond that. I think one of the biggest challenges now when you think about brands, though, is that making that connection is really, really tough. And we're going to talk in just a second about sort of why that is so tough. But there's a reason why there's just a handful of brands when you think about sort of the millions of different companies and logos out there. There's a reason why this does get to be so tough. And I think a lot of you will probably suspect that there's a lot of noise out there. Like consumers these days are bombarded by so much content. And I would be curious to find out, or maybe to get a sense from folks, basic things like how many apps do you honestly have on your phone? And then realistically, how many apps do you realistically use on a regular basis? There's so much noise that we as consumers are being bombarded with on a daily basis. And so, TikTok has over 1 billion users worldwide. There are over, if you can wrap your head around this, there are over 3.2 billion images and 720,000 hours of videos that are uploaded every single day. On Instagram, 95 million plus photos and videos are uploaded on a daily basis. And then when you think about the internet just at large, there are over 1.4 billion different websites on the internet. But of those, and this is, I think, actually the more interesting fact, only about 200 million of them are actually active. And then I had to just throw in, the random cat photo because I would say they're probably, and feel free if you're a cat or a dog person, there's also just an infinite number of cat memes. And, I remember, I think this was maybe from last summer or the summer before, the cats in the slices of, cats in slices of bread trend that's, I think went around on TikTok for a little while too. But again, the whole idea here is that we have a pretty short attention span and you're constantly being bombarded with content. And so companies have a really tough job when they're thinking about how do they make their brand memorable? How do they make it stand out? The example that I like to use with folks too is, if any of you watch the Super Bowl, most people, I think Super Bowl viewers are sort of split into two camps. You've got the camp that actually wants to watch the game. Then you have the camp that sort of just wants to watch the commercials. And I always ask folks, I do a workshop like this, in the winter as well. And I always ask folks, what was the most memorable Super Bowl ad that you saw, but do you actually remember what they were trying to sell you? And 9 times out of 10, folks will remember what was funny or memorable about the commercial, but a lot of times it's hard to put your finger on what they're actually trying to sell you. So that sparks a whole other debate about is the brand actually doing its job if folks can't even remember what they're trying to pitch. So we're going to pivot a little bit now and start talking a little bit how this affects people. And so what I would encourage you to think a little bit about, so again, we're talking about the internet, we're talking about stuff on massive scale. What does this mean for you as a student? My guess is if you're joining us today, you're probably a little bit ahead of the curve in the sense that you're thinking actively about college, you're thinking actively about your profile, about how you want to present yourself to colleges, which means, you're probably a pretty big fish and maybe a relatively small pond. When you think about college, your pond just became an ocean. And so one of the big things about branding is how do you stand out? Like, how do you stand out amongst all of those other big fish who are now joining this much larger ocean? So let's talk a little bit more about personal branding. So here are some folks. Hopefully you recognize at least one of these folks, if not all of them. But again, would love to hear your thoughts in the chat. What do you think about when you think about some of these folks? What do they have in common? If you want to be specific and sort of share something that's that you might know about one of their brands in particular, would love to just get a sense, especially from folks again dialing in from all across the globe. Would love to get a sense of what you're thinking about some of these folks and what you think about when you think about their personal brands. Brian, any interesting thoughts so far?
Most popular are famous, leadership, successful is coming in a lot. On TV often, prestige, but I think most of the ones I see are famous and leadership tend to be like very common among all of these coming in.
Strong themes coming through. Awesome. And then I'll go ahead and run through these just in case there are some folks who don't recognize everyone. So in the yellow, we have Sarah Blakely, who is the founder of Spanx and also a well-known philanthropist. In the middle upper box here, we have Jacinda Ardern, who's the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. On the upper right, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And then coming around clockwise, we have Rihanna, who, if folks don't recognize her music, they might also recognize her because of the billions of dollars she has made on her beauty brands. And then lastly, we have Jose Andres, who is a world-renowned chef, but who has also really made a huge mark in the philanthropy space through his organization, World Central Kitchen. I like Jose Andres and Rihanna for this example, because when you really do think about folks, I think the folks on top certainly have built very strong brands, either around a consumer product, and being very successful business people, or as political leaders. But even if you think about President Zelensky, for those of you who maybe did not know this, he was actually a comedian and an actor long before he became president of Ukraine. And so again, when you think about the personal brand that he sort of built as a professional actor, as a professional comedian, and how some of those traits have now evolved into his leadership style in Ukraine. Rihanna is another great example. Again, amazing musical artist, but a lot of folks probably don't realize that she not only is she the richest female musician, but she's actually the second richest female entertainer just behind Oprah Winfrey. And a lot of that has been driven, music didn't actually make her a billionaire. It was the beauty brands that she chose to invest in and grow. So really diversifying her portfolio and creating a very iconic beauty brand. And then finally, with Jose Andres, as I mentioned, world-renowned chef, has a handful of restaurants out here on the East Coast, and so really had built a very strong brand and reputation as a chef and culinary influencer on the East Coast, but really could not sit by and stand by watching horrible things happening around the world. And so whenever there have been natural disasters, his World Central Kitchen goes and shows up and stays and cooks meals for folks on the ground who are helping. And so again, has really sort of evolved his own personal brand to do multiple and very different things. And so I urge you, when you start thinking a little bit about your own personal brands, again, there isn't one tried and true formula. There isn't one brand that you need to be. I think depending on the circumstances, depending on where you are in your life, your brand is going to and certainly will. I would encourage you to think about how it evolves. So let's actually talk a little bit about now what goes into building a personal brand. So when you think about this, there really are three components in this, and it does sort of create this really nice virtuous cycle. So we'll start with expertise. And what I want to encourage you to think a little bit more about is that, expertise isn't just a skill or a talent. And so again, since we're talking about college admissions, in 2022, Harvard had over 4,000 valedictorians from their high school classes apply for just 2,000 spots. again, it's not to say that if you're not a valedictorian, it doesn't mean you have a prayer of getting into Harvard, because there were a lot of folks who got into Harvard who were not valedictorians. It's more just to say that, even if you are the smart one at your school, when you're looking at a competitive school like a Harvard or another, elite brand, everyone is going to be smart. Like, you can't build a brand necessarily on just one thing. You can't build it on just this notion that I'm the smart one. I may be dating myself, Brian. This reference you will definitely get, but I realize this movie might not resonate with a lot of high school students. But if any of you have ever seen The Breakfast Club, there were these great sort of labels that were applied to all of the characters in the movie. There was the brain, there was the jock, there was the beauty or the princess, there was the rebel, and then there was sort of the recluse. Again, I think it's easy in high school to have sort of labels attached to you, like you are one thing. But as you are thinking about, your personal brand, and Brian, I won't pull you on which profile you fell into. I would encourage you to think about, like, what else, and this is where the other two components come in. What else makes you tick? What else defines you as a person? And so that sort of leads us to the next two areas. This idea about authenticity. So what makes you you? And I will throw in just a spoiler alert here. The Common App actually has a prompt about this, where they ask you to talk about something that is unique to you, that your application would be incomplete if you didn't talk about it. And then this idea of purpose. So what gets you out of bed in the morning? This isn't what you do because you have to do it. It's what do you do, or how do you choose to spend your time if given the choice? And with a lot of the students that I work with, if you're struggling trying to think about how to answer some of these questions, a lot of times I'll ask my students, if you had a free day, because obviously we know everyone is busy and overscheduled these days, but if you had a free day and you woke up and you have nothing on your calendar, no responsibilities, how would you choose to spend that 8 or 10 hours? What would you do? And it's interesting, the things that students come up with, because more often than not, a lot of things that students want to do in that, with that magical hypothetical free day aren't necessarily tied to a lot of the things that they're doing in school. So I would encourage you to think about, as you are thinking about what's important to you, what is important to you when you start thinking about college, ask yourself these questions. Again, with the authenticity piece, what makes you you? With regards, and very specifically, when you think about the personal statement, for example, in the Common App, I'll give you an example. I had a student a couple of years ago who talked about, we were talking about sort of special talents, and he held the Guinness Book of World Records, or he held a Guinness Book of World record for a very obscure talent or a very obscure skill. And it was interesting because his personal statement wasn't so much about writing about the fact that he held this world record. And I'll tell you right now, it was in something called pillow spinning. His essay and his essay and sort of the beauty of this came from what sort of led up to discovering that this was just some sort of, a fun, quirky talent that he had. Again, he would probably be the first to tell you that it wasn't necessarily something that got him out of bed in the morning, but it was something that was very authentic and unique to him. And the process that he went through and sort of discovering that he had this sort of superpower was a really interesting one. So again, I urge you, if you start thinking about these things, ask yourself some of these questions. And again, if you're still struggling, think a little bit about, the time that you spent in high school, because chances are you've all either worked either on a group project with other students, or you are a part of a team, whether it be through a club or a sport. And I would ask you to think about, on different teams or in different groups, what role do you play? What role do you typically play? What role would you like to play? And think a little bit about what are maybe then some of the skills or some of the the experiences that you'd like to that you would like to try to develop in order to get you there. And then what skills do you use to be effective in those various roles? And then start looking for patterns, because some of these things will start giving you some clues about the things that maybe make you tick, that that maybe you weren't aware of before. So now let's move on and talk a little bit more about when we talk about personal branding for college. And spoiler alert here, again, it's a little bit more than a LinkedIn headline. I've broken this out into a couple of different buckets here. And so again, when we go back to this idea of purpose, think about, what is your end goal? And I'll be honest, the end goal isn't necessarily, hey, I want to go to college. But I would encourage you to think a little bit more about, what is what's the, what is sort of the end goal? Is it, is it a particular career? Is it a particular job? Is it maybe an organization or a product or a service that you want to invent? Is it, an organization that you would love to be a part of? And I would encourage you to think a little bit about this in phases too. It is okay to have more than one goal. And honestly, I think for high school students, I would encourage you, because you're at a point where you're probably trying and learning a lot of new things, it is more than okay to have more than one goal. And more importantly, to even have phases to think about how you're going to get there. Another aspect around personal branding is this idea of competition. So thinking about who is going to be in your competitive set. So I talked a little bit earlier about, the example with Harvard and the valedictorians. When you think about the schools that you're going to be applying to, or the career pathways that you're interested in, so if you're, for example, very interested in STEM and you're thinking about computer science, think a little bit about who's going to be in my competitive set when I'm applying to college. What are they going to be really good at? And then think a little bit more about yourself. What are you really good at? And maybe what are you better at? Find those differentiators. So if you are interested, for example, in studying computer science, but maybe there's also a part of you that really, that really loves art, or something that is, a little more, typically right-brained, think about how you can lean into some of those other, into those other skills, those experiences, again, to differentiate your brand, so that when you are applying side by side with all of those other folks who want to be, STEM majors or computer science majors, there's something that a school can look at and see, is there something different and unique about you that you bring to the table? That segues nicely into our third bucket here about audience, and this idea of, thinking about who are you really trying to convince or persuade. And in this case, for most of you, it's going to be an admissions officer at a university. But I would encourage you to take this framework. As I mentioned before, this can be applied to just about anything. If you are applying for internships, as you start thinking about summer jobs, this framework can absolutely be applied to writing cover letters, working on resumes, thinking about how you prepare for interviews for these various roles. And so think about who your target audience is and what is going to be important to them. Again, if you're talking to an admissions officer, they are looking to build a well-rounded, diverse class. And so what value are you bringing to the table? Which now segues very nicely into your mission statement. And so you may hear people call it a lot of different things. It could be an elevator pitch. But it could really, at the end of the day, just be a couple of bullet points around what are the 2 or 3 things that you want someone to remember about you, and what is important to you. So again, this goes back to this idea of being authentic, having a purpose. And then finally, thinking about as you deliver this, how do you want to be perceived? And so again, we go back to authenticity. I think, especially when you're thinking about college admissions, I think it's really difficult sometimes to figure out how to create a brand on essentially a digital piece of paper. And so make sure that as you are describing yourself, as you're talking about your dreams, your aspirations, your experiences, that you are staying authentic, that you're writing in a way that is very authentic to who you are as a person. And making sure that you're not necessarily, that you don't lose your voice trying to present yourself as something that you think your target audience wants to hear about. Because the other thing I will tell you right now is that, the folks reading your applications have been doing this usually for a pretty long time. And they are pretty good at sniffing out authenticity or lack thereof. So when in doubt, go with your gut, because your gut typically isn't going to steer you wrong. All right, so let's talk a little bit about drafting a personal brand statement. And I'm doing a quick time check. I think we're about halfway through. So I think, Brian, if it's all right with you, I'll sort of tee this up as an exercise folks can do on their own. But I think that we maybe in the interest of time, I've got some more valuable nuggets I want to make sure that we share. So, but what I would encourage you to do is sit down and think about, again, about how would others describe you as a team member? How would they describe you as a leader? This is also a great activity you can do with your friends and with your peers, as well as parents, teachers, anyone with whom you're engaging on a regular basis. I always ask folks, can you describe someone? What are the 5 adjectives they would use to describe you? And then once you have those adjectives, maybe ask them to back it up with a story or an example. And I think it's always interesting because the way that we perceive ourselves is often very different. I think sometimes we're our own worst critic. The way that we perceive ourselves is probably a little bit harsher than the way others do. And so you might be surprised with the feedback that you get from folks. In that same vein, thinking about what are, I always call them superpowers. What are the things that, what's the superpower you're bringing to the table? Are you a great collaborator? Do you find a way of engaging with folks to bring them together to collaborate on a common goal? And then the last piece here is this, I always call this sort of the litmus test or the gut check. are you someone you would want, like, would you want to be your roommate in college, or would you want to be someone's classmate or, or teammate for a particular class project? And think about the traits that make for good roommates and classmates. It's interesting. There's a Stanford essay that actually asks you to write a letter to your future roommate, which is a great opportunity to sort of present that personal brand through a very different lens. So I'd encourage you to sit down, draft these statements, and then share them with folks with whom you're comfortable, but more importantly, with folks who are going to give you really honest feedback. And this is a great starting point that you can use as you start thinking about some of these college applications, around your personal statement, around your letters of recommendation, when you think about the types of stories you want folks to tell about you, as well as a lot of these supplemental essays. All right, so let's now segue and talk a little bit more about competitive admissions itself. It's no surprise to anyone here. I think it is definitely getting tougher. COVID-19 and the pandemic had a huge impact on admissions. I think some of the obvious ones are, the SAT and the ACT became optional. There was obviously some challenges with learning loss at schools, application volumes at a lot of schools went through the roofs. And I think for students, in addition to being challenged with virtual learning, as I'm sure many of you have, the way that you engage to participate in activities really had to change and evolve as well. I think, one of the things that I've worked through with a lot of students over the last couple of years is, being in a virtual environment, how are you able to engage, have impact, show leadership when, your clubs all had to meet virtually and you couldn't do things in person for a couple of years. And so I think for a lot of students, it created some unique opportunities to be very creative and innovative. But for many students, it was really tough just trying to figure out how do you navigate these waters. And I would say really, the takeaway here is that at the end of the day, admissions has become very complicated and far more competitive than ever. And what I would encourage you to think about is less about the past and more thinking about the future and thinking about what are the things that are within your span of control. So I always tell students, control what you can control. And unfortunately, you can't do a whole lot about the rest of it other than think about what you can do within your own sphere of influence. Acceptance rates. So I always like to talk a little bit about acceptance rates because when I work with students, they'll come oftentimes with a school list and they'll separate their schools into safety, into target, into reach schools. And, and I appreciate the fact that students are doing due diligence. It's fantastic. It's great research. It's a great first step to start thinking about where you stack up versus your competition. What I would encourage you to think a little bit about, and especially since we've seen, again, the SAT and the ACT becoming optional, as well as these historic application volumes in a lot of schools, not all acceptance rate numbers, and that's why it's in quotes here, are necessarily created equally. And so, I'll use a couple of examples, particularly from some well-known schools. So the University of Michigan, if you Google the University of Michigan and acceptance rates, you'll get a number back that's somewhere between 19 and 21%, which for a lot of students feels, okay, that's super competitive. That's maybe 1 in 5 students are getting in. The reality of it is that if you're out of state, that number represents an aggregate of in-state and out of state and all of the majors. If you're an out-of-state student, a non-Michigan resident, that acceptance rate drops to 12%. The same thing happens when you look at the University of Virginia. 27% is the number that they report, which again, 1 in 3, a little bit better than Michigan, but 12% is the statistic for out-of-state residents. And then a school like University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which has now seen year-over-year historic volumes for the last, I believe, 4 years and counting. It's interesting, the state of North Carolina has now capped out-of-state registrations, or basically volume, at 18%. So schools can't have more than 18% of non-resident students. What that means is for in-state North Carolina residents, depending on the school you're applying to, depending on your major, the admit rate can be anywhere from 19 to 42%. If you are out of state at UNC Chapel Hill, that number now drops to 10%. And so I would encourage students that, as you think about researching, as you start thinking about how to sort of bucket some of these schools, again, do your due diligence, take a look at, and dig into those acceptance rates a little bit more closely. It also is going to vary based on, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, or alluded to earlier, based on the school you're applying to or your specialty. So the University of Washington, for example, a lot of students on the West Coast, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest, will look at University of Washington as a safety school because their admit rate is 60%. If you're a Washington resident, it's 51% for out of state. However, if you're one of those folks who really wants to major in STEM or specifically computer science, if you're a non-Washington resident and you want to apply as a comp sci major, that admit rate now drops to 3%. And so you're talking about an admit rate that rivals Harvard, Princeton, or any of the other Ivy Leagues. And so you want to think through, again, as you're looking at schools, as you're doing that research, how does this stack up with, with some of my demographic information, but also how do these schools align with what I'm interested in? And that can be also a part of your strategy when you're thinking about the schools that you're looking at applying to. I think New York University, NYU is another great example. Their overall admit rate is usually somewhere around 19%. But if you're looking to apply to the College of Arts and Sciences or Stern, their business school, that number drops to 7%. On the flip side, if you wanted to look at interdisciplinary studies, Gallatin, the admit rate at Gallatin, it is selective, but it's 30%. And so obviously it's a much smaller applicant pool, but students often have an easier time applying to Gallatin at NYU as opposed to some of those other schools. So really the big takeaway here is don't pick or classify your schools based on raw numbers. Make sure that you're doing your due diligence, make sure you're doing your research, and just be open to different possibilities as you start digging into some of those numbers. For the SAT and the ACT, what I will just say here about the SAT and ACT is, with the SAT and ACT becoming optional at so many schools and now being brought back and also going digital this fall, there's obviously a huge debate around testing and whether or not you should submit your scores. What I would encourage you to think about is, I think if you're a freshman or a sophomore or even a junior, actually, if you can carve out the time, take a practice test. I think the PSAT is a great indicator of how you might perform, but take a diagnostic test and see how you do. It is, if you're looking at competitive schools and if you are testing well, but what I mean by well is if you're testing somewhere around a school average or median score, it's worth the time and effort into putting in the time and effort to prepare for these exams. Because if your score is going to be at or above the reported average, it's another data point that can help you stand out as schools are looking at your file. I think, what I would say is if your scores are below that mark, what it really is telling you is it's giving you an opportunity to make sure that you've got other data points on your transcript, on your resume, that you need to make sure are making up for some of those potential weaknesses on standardized tests. And so, testing, I think, is can be a tricky conversation. But again, if you think about your SAT or ACT score, again, is another component of your overall portfolio, is another component of your brand. There are other ways to compensate potentially for some deficiencies if you're not coming in at or above that average score. So well-rounded versus specialist. So this is something I receive a lot of questions about because students will come to me and say, is it better to specialize in just one thing? Again, we kind of go back to a little, it reminds me a little bit of that, about those labels that we talked about with around expertise a few slides ago. Should I just pick one activity and be really good at it? Or is it good to try a bunch of different things and be, and be sort of be very well-rounded, be a generalist? And really the fact of the matter here is, schools don't expect you to have more than 10 activities or things on your resume that you've been super involved in. It's also not fair to say necessarily that you want to have just one thing. I think it's important to strike balance because, again, what schools are looking for is they want to see students who can show a good balance between academic rigor and extracurricular activities. And a lot of what admissions officers are really looking for is, what type of person are you going to be on campus? They don't necessarily want someone who's just going to come to campus, go to class, go to the library, kind of check in, check out, or clock in, clock out. They really want folks who are going to make the campus a better, more well-rounded, diverse place. And again, it's not to say that you need 10 or 15 activities, but it is important to show that you have interests that extend well beyond the classroom as well. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on briefly here is the impact around the recent Supreme Court ruling around affirmative action. And all I'll say about this is just, the reality of it is this is not going to impact the vast majority of schools. But if you are looking at competitive schools, which I have a hunch most of you are, those are the schools by and large who are affected. And I think that, when you think about, and I think this is where, just to underscore the importance of personal branding, if you are a person of color, a student of color, I would really think about your comfort level and incorporating any elements of that into your brand story. For a lot of students, it's not something they necessarily want to be defined by or want to incorporate into their story. But I would encourage you, as you're thinking about what your brand story looks like, and if you are a student of color, it may be worth thinking about how do you incorporate that in a very authentic and organic way into your branding story, just to make sure that schools are getting the full picture of who you are as a person. All right, let's now segue into this idea of fit. And so what schools are looking for, and I think, again, nothing on this list should really be earth shattering at this point. These are all things that are really, that you probably all know. But I think, the takeaways that I want you to walk away from this are, number one, it's really important to know what schools require or what they're looking for. So for example, if you're looking at this list and you're interested in schools in California, the UC schools, they don't take test scores, they don't take letters of recommendation. And so any time and energy you're sort of spending on those things, if your top choice is the UC school, or if you're looking exclusively at UC schools, it's not going to be the best way of expending energy. When I look at some of the things on the bottom of this list, so when you talk about a distinct POV or alignment with school's mission, I would encourage you to think about when you talk about POV, and we'll dive a little bit more into sort of schools' mission statements and values in just a minute. But when you think about a distinct POV, there are specific schools. I mentioned the Stanford essay earlier with the roommate essay. Stanford, Chicago has a very unique way of asking sort of long form essays that sort of get at what your distinct sort of POV is on things. Georgetown, not to be biased, but I am a little bit, obviously, having spent so much time there. Georgetown is very specific in one of their long form essays around basically, why do you want to go to Georgetown? Why do our values align? How do our values align with yours? And so making sure that as you think about how you're drafting these essays, for the Common App personal statement, for example, you get 250 to 650 words. You've got limited real estate to tell your story. I would think about these, especially on these supplemental essays as well, as you think about what is the brand that you're trying to convey, what's the story that you're trying to tell, making sure that you're pulling in elements from your brand story into each of these essays, whether it be a long form essay or one of those supplemental essays. When we talk a little bit about alignment with schools' mission and values, I think this also applies to academic areas. I had a student a couple of years ago who was very interested in marine biology and came to the table with basically two schools. I want to go to Miami. I want to go to Duke. They're the best schools in my mind for marine biology. And these are the two. And, as we thought about how do we sort of adjust and sort of build out her brand story to align with these schools, it was really important that they are two very different schools, two excellent universities, but they are two very different schools in terms of sort of mission, value proposition, and really sort of what they bring to the table. And so it's important to make sure, even if you are applying within a very specific academic area or niche, it's very, very important to make sure that you're aligning that with what schools are laying out in terms of their value proposition, or in terms of what they're looking for. And so let's now dive a little bit into sort of how this manifests with universities as well. So I wanted to include two examples, and I'll give you just a moment to take a look at this. I've bold-faced some of the text here as well too, but I think that this is important. When you start thinking about universities, on the surface, Georgetown and Columbia they're two elite institutions, two elite private institutions in very large metropolitan areas, New York City and Washington, D.C. But when you start diving into their mission statements and their value statements, and these I pulled directly from their websites, it's interesting to see how they talk about their values and what they value. So Georgetown leads with this idea of valuing students who are well-rounded, this concept of service, of social justice. If you dive into Georgetown's values a little bit more deeply, they talk extensively about this notion of something called cura personalis and educating men and women to be global citizens and men and women for others. Columbia leads right away with this idea that they are a center of research, that they are a distinguished learning environment. It is very, very heavy on the academics. And as you look at both of these side by side, I think you could certainly say that both schools are certainly very academically rigorous and they value academics, but the way that they talk about it and the way that they position it within their mission statements will tell you a lot about how you want to talk about these things in your essays and in those applications. And so the takeaway here really is just this recognition that schools are going to give you a roadmap for what they value and what they're looking for in applicants. And so as a part of your research, make sure that you're including time spending time on their websites, reading their mission statements, reading their values, and understanding the language that they're using to talk about what they do and what they value. And I'll give you a hint here as well. This process will work really well for resume and job hunting as well. So any job description is going to be a roadmap for what a company values and what they're looking for in terms of a future employee. So this is a great skill set to continue to flex and to build over time as well. Okay, I wanted to segue and make sure that we covered sort of the actual checklist. So I know that most of you are grades 9 through 12. So wanted to run through a little bit of what are the things that you can be doing now. And I realize that this is a very it's a little text heavier slide that I'd like to share, but I think there's some great detail in here. So for 9th and 10th graders, the most important thing is establishing a really strong academic base. So make sure that you're taking challenging courses, focus on your grades. A poor grade in 9th grade is not going to completely derail you, but it's really important if you do have a blemish on your transcript early on, that you continue to show improvement, that you show schools that that you were able to learn something from that, and you've been doubling down on your academics. With regards to extracurriculars, I think early on, pick a couple. Chances are you're probably going to continue to build on activities that maybe you've started in middle school. Refine as you go. And make sure that you're not forgetting service work. For many schools, and I'll include Georgetown as an example, the #1 activity that admitted students have is community service or volunteer work. And so make sure that you are including that as a part of your schedule and as part of your just sort of as an ongoing discipline. In terms of testing, as I mentioned, grade 10, you'll take the PSAT. It's a great warm up for grade 11 when you'll take the PSAT again and has national merit implications. The big things here, summers. So I always tell students, especially in 9th and 10th grade, you always want to be learning and doing something. And what I mean by that is, as you think about how to set up your summer, you don't have to fill every waking hour of your summer. Part of your summer should absolutely be spent decompressing a little bit and recharging your batteries. But it's always great to kind of go into summer thinking, I want to learn something. And it could be something academic. It could be a completely different skill set. And then you should also try to do something. And again, whether that be an internship, whether it be volunteer work, but learning and doing is going to really set you up well for college. It'll also help you start experimenting and thinking through what are the important things that, or what are the things that are important to me? What are the things that I value? Again, when you think about this idea of authenticity and purpose, what are the things that are going to get me out of bed in the morning? And then I would be remiss if I didn't just remind you to read, and read some more. Again, read things that are interesting to you, but all of these skills are going to, and will help you, will certainly help you and pay dividends as you go into high school and into 11th and 12th grade, as well as in college. For our juniors, I think most of you probably know or have heard that you need to keep your grades up academically. This is the most important year academically because it will be the last full set of grades that a university sees. Most universities will see either quarter, trimester grades in the fall, maybe fall semester grades if you're applying for regular decision schools. But in terms of a complete academic picture for an academic year, 11th grade is the last full year they're going to have. For testing, you'll do PSAT in the fall. Spring, I would really encourage you to think about SAT or ACT in the spring, and that way you can take some time as well to prepare if you need to retest over the summer. And then school visits. So I would spend some time in the spring of your junior year thinking through what are things that are important to you, what traits are important to you, and then trying to schedule some school visits to start pressure testing some of those preferences. I'd also encourage you to seek out and create leadership opportunities. And what I mean by that is, it's not enough just to say, hey, I'm going to be captain of the varsity swim team, or hey, I'm going to be the captain of this or president of this particular club. If there are limited opportunities, particularly if you come from a smaller high school, I always encourage students to think about, being a leader doesn't mean you have a title, a fancy title. It means that you're trying to find ways that you can organically influence or help lead other groups, whether it be through mentorship, whether it be through demonstrated leadership. And so this really is a great opportunity to think a little more creatively about other ways that you can sort of flex that muscle. Again, spring of junior year, you also want to be working on refining that school list, start thinking through early action, early decision, regular decision, what that might look like. And then especially in the spring, you want to make sure that you're identifying teachers to write your letters of recommendation. And especially if you are applying early to any schools, make sure that you are asking those teachers before you leave for summer break. Especially with deadlines being mid-October, early November, it is asking a lot of teachers to ask them as soon as you get back, sometimes in September, and chances are their dance card might already be full. So I encourage you to try to reach out to those teachers if you can before you leave for break, or over the summer if you're able to. And then lastly, grade 12, you've got obviously applications, financial aid, you've got all the scholarship applications. And then the spring, I think there's a fair bit to be said about waitlist and deferral strategies. So depending on how things go, what you're hearing from schools, there's a good bit of time and energy to be spent thinking through, how you're going to select a school. And if you were, for example, waitlisted at your top choice, what that looks like, what other options you have, at your disposal, and how you're going to tackle those. And so, in many ways, grade 12 really is sort of the culmination, of everything you've done throughout high school, but also I think spending a little bit of time thinking ahead to what your university experience will look like. I always encourage students, especially once they have the school application and sort of that piece behind them, to spend some time spring of their senior year, reaching out to folks either in their network or asking their parents to help them reach out and scheduling lunch or coffee chats or hot chocolate or lemonade chats. If you're not a coffee person, probably not yet, or just scheduling intro calls, Zoom calls with people who have interesting career pathways. And so again, the more that you can learn about the different types of skills that people are building, the different types of career pathways that people are building, better equipped you'll be when you get to college to think about about the different pathways that might be open and available to you all. I'm going to pause there. I know I went through a lot of information. I was trying to keep an eye on the time, Brian, because I wanted to make sure we left about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I will pause there and pass it back over to you and see if there are questions that folks have. But I will just say at this point, thank you so much for your time today. And hopefully folks learned a thing or two about building their brand.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I was looking for a logo on that cup as you were drinking it, see what we can learn about brand from that. But thank you so much. Thanks to all of you guys for great questions out there. And we've got a lot of them. We're trying to get to as many of the kind of most commonly applicable ones. Reminder for everyone, this is part of a summer-long series. So a lot of folks have, some specific questions about, in my situation, what should I write about? Who should write my letters of recommendation? We've got a lot of great small group classes for Varsity Tutors Learning members about, step-by-step putting together your application essays and all those kind of things. So if your questions don't get answered here, that's okay. We do have answers for you, but with about 10 minutes left here, wanted to hit some of the most common ones. And so I'm going to drop down. Quite a few people are asking about social media and personal branding. And so one thing I wanted to point out is we actually do have a social media influencer star, Eitan, who's a cooking social media influencer, who is a student at Columbia, which came up today, doing a live viral video creation on Wednesday with us. If you want specific advice, some people are asking, how do I get more followers? How do we get more likes? That's not necessarily this session, but it's part of personal brand. We've got a cool session coming up on Wednesday for you. But Joanna, back more kind of specific to whether it's college applications, job interviews, and those kind of things. How much does your brand on social media matter to when schools are assessing you? Or, should you be concerned about having a brand on social media if you don't already, about trying to show social proofing that you have followers and likes and those kind of things? What's your advice specific to social media and personal branding, maybe let's say for college admissions?
That is a great question. What I would say about social media is, everyone's on social media these days. I would encourage you. Not every single school is going to go in and audit everyone's social media account, but I would think about your social media account essentially as an extension, as a reflection and an extension of your personal brand. But it's interesting. I might be dating myself at this point as well. But I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was don't ever put anything either in writing or in an email or online that you wouldn't want that you would be mortified if it showed up on the New York Times front page, basically. And the litmus test there was, would you be okay if your parents saw this? And that, I will be honest, that has steered me well in my career. But what I would say there is, again, it's less about the number of followers or being viewed as an influencer, because I'll be honest with you, schools aren't really going to care about that because you're not necessarily bringing all those followers and influencers with you to campus. I think the larger piece here is, you want to make sure that the brand that you are building on social media is consistent and with the brand that you're trying to sell to a school, essentially, or you're trying to portray to a school. But more importantly, you want to make sure that things are appropriate. And so if you have the time, well, first off, I would say I would make the time, go through, do an audit of your social media, get rid of anything, again, that you use that litmus test, and get rid of anything that you would be mortified if your parents saw on the front page of the New York Times. Because chances are, you just don't want to take any chances that someone is going to do a random audit and stumble across something that might be questionable. There have been a lot of stories anecdotally in the news over the last couple of years about schools either rescinding acceptances because of things that they have found, things that students have done, have said, TikTok videos. And so you want to make sure, because they're not consistent with the values that the school holds to be true. And so I would spend some time certainly making sure that your social media is cleaned up. And the other thing I would suggest too is I would clamp down on your social media and make those accounts private. If there's a little bit of a delta maybe between the brand that you are choosing to build on social media and the one that you're portraying to a school, then I would number one, I would absolutely clamp down and make all those accounts private.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks again to everyone who's asking those. If you want more specific social media advice on your social media brand for its own sake, come join us a little bit later on this week. Also foreshadow another event we've got coming up next week is Deborah Duran's back with to talk about extracurriculars. Those who have been to, she's been an Ivy League admissions officer and all those kind of things. We had a couple specific to extracurriculars and your brand. So I want to hit those up here. And I know we had a lot of questions there. So people can come back next week for even more specific to those. Few people asking things like, how many extracurriculars should I think about taking? How do I pick extracurriculars that like do certain extracurricular activities say more or less about my brand? And then when is it too late to pick up new extracurriculars? I think some of your advice was really dive into it in 9th and 10th grade. Does it get too late in 11th and 12th grade to pick up new things? But how should we think about how extracurriculars and specifically when we choose them and which ones we choose relate to our brands?
Or no, another great question. I would say, again, for folks who have middle schoolers, so for the folks who have 6th and 7th graders, again, I would use that time certainly to continue sort of exploring interest and sort of seeing, what types of things your kids are interested in, what sort of things stick, and I always tell folks a good extracurricular isn't necessarily the thing that you are great at or the thing that you're best at. It's going to be one of those things that you genuinely want to spend time doing. It's going to be, again, it goes back to that idea of purpose. It's what's the kind of thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. Because again, when you start thinking now about your college application, your personal statement, and then when you start talking about what you want to do long term, ideally your extracurriculars should align with what you want to do in the long term. I think it's perfectly fine, and schools understand that there's a bit of experimentation that happens in high school too, where you're thinking through, well, maybe I want to try this new activity, or maybe I want to pick up a new sport and try something new. That is great because it shows that you're not afraid of taking risks, taking chances, and that you're creative and curious. But if you have this whole long list of sort of things that you started but didn't necessarily finish, that can be a red flag to schools as well. And so I would, I think it's perfectly acceptable freshman year, maybe even sophomore year, to have, more activities, and then to sort of whittle that down as you get into 11th and 12th grade and really lean into those much more heavily. I talked about trying to create leadership opportunities for yourself, with those activities. I think that's a great way, again, to continue to demonstrate interest and passion for some of those things. But it's also a great way to show that you're not just showing up, clocking in, clocking out, that you're actually trying to grow with those activities and looking to evolve with them. The other thing I would just mention here is that, on the Common App, on the activity list, it'll ask you on average how many weeks a year you're spending doing an activity and how many hours a week. And I always tell students, the activities that are sort of like the 1 hour a week activities, a lot of those can sometimes feel like those are just the clock in, clock out activities. Those are the ones where you're not necessarily growing and evolving with the activity. It's the activities where you start getting into 3, 5, 7 hours a week, where schools can see, well, now you're choosing to spend potentially up to an hour a day working on something. That means that you really are doubling down, that you have some type of interest, that you have some sort of passion for it. And hopefully that will, that's going to align with some of the other things you're sharing in your application as well. So there isn't a hard and fast rule when it comes to extracurriculars or how to pick them or when to start them. I would say it's never too late to start something, but make sure that you're picking something that is consistent and aligns with some of your other activities, or with some of the interests that you have in college as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's been asking. Reminder, there will be even more events specific to extracurriculars and those kind of things coming up, because we covered a lot of ground here, and all summer long, we're going to be coming back to a lot of these major themes and fitting them to all the components of your applications. Another one I wanted to hit is about course selection, class selection. You talked about that, sort of, being well-rounded versus specializing in something. And people wanted to ask a little bit about, is it helpful to, if you can only take so many AP classes in a semester, to make them all STEM focused, or to diversify, or, how else should we think about how course selection reflects on our brand and how intentional we need to be about that when picking our classes?
I think, course selection is tough because, again, not every high school is created equally. In certain schools, as I've learned over the years, some schools will cap how many APs. I know that I had worked with a student a few years ago whose school capped the number of APs at 2 per semester that they could take. Other students, are trying to double down and take as many as they can because, the weighted GPA certainly helps. And so what I would say about that is, think a little bit about the things you're interested in. I think there was a myth for a long time that if you wanted to be competitive and get into an Ivy League school, you had to have Calc BC on your transcript. And the reality is if you are looking at STEM, or if you're thinking about being pre-med or anything, computer science related, then yes, if Calc BC is offered, you should probably have Calc BC on your transcript. But if you want to be a humanities major and you hate math, you don't necessarily need to take Calc BC. And so again, think about the things that are, that are going to align with what you are interested in, but also, and I think this is the other thing that sometimes gets lost, is you also want to make sure you're taking classes that are going to challenge you, but that that you have the potential to be successful in. Because again, at the end of the day, the transcript isn't going to lie. Your grades are going to be what they are, and you need to make sure that you can back that up. And so if you are not a math person, you should not be stacking your senior year transcript with AP Stats, Calc BC, and AP Physics. I mean, I think it's just a recipe for disaster, quite frankly. And honestly, you're going to be miserable. But I would think a lot about, what are your interests? What are you thinking about studying in college? And just making sure that your course selection, again, is consistent with what you're thinking about doing in the long term.
Awesome. I love that. And it goes right back to brand, right? It's what are the things you're interested in, passionate about, willing to put in the work to be great at, and all those kind of things. So, and if that's consistent with what your goals are, then, focusing on the classes that are part of that brand, it all carries through. And, it's one consistent brand message that those reading your applications who, you wish had hours to look at, but probably have 10 minutes or so, will be able to get that message. Hey, we mentioned at the beginning, we had a lot of middle schoolers out here. And so wanted to make sure we did something specific to them. So we've been talking about college, which is a few years away. How does this, kind of correlate or manifest itself for middle schoolers who may be thinking about applying to different high schools, or even getting started on their personal brand? What advice do you have specific to middle schoolers?
Oh, I love this. So no offense to all the high schoolers there, but the beauty about being in middle school is everything that you're doing in middle school, it doesn't count on your college application, because colleges are never going to ask you about anything you did before 9th grade. So use that time to explore, to experiment, to try everything. This is the time, honestly, when you should be, and I would say even pre-middle school, you should be trying just about everything and seeing what else is out there, and really figuring out what are the things that you like, what are some of the things that you're good at. And then frankly, what are the things that you want to continue to grow with? I think, middle school is a great time for that, quite frankly, because if you can hit the ground running in high school with, a sense of, maybe I'm still trying to figure out a couple of things, but if you've got at least a rough list of 3 to 5 things that you kind of like and that you're kind of good at, it's giving you a pretty great roadmap to get started. The other thing I would say is with middle schools, especially if you're someone who's thinking about applying to a competitive or highly selective high school, and I work with middle school clients and even elementary school clients who are trying to apply to competitive grade schools and elementary schools. This exact same process works in a slightly different scaled version for high school admissions as well. Every competitive high school is going to have a mission statement, value statement. They're going to have essays. They're going to need letters of recommendation. They're going to need a transcript. All of this is going to apply because, again, every competitive high school is going to have will have a brand that they manifest and that they are putting out there. And so it's important as you're thinking about those schools and applying to those schools that, again, that your personal brand aligns with that high school as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks everyone who's thinking about this stuff so early. It's just kind of neat to see.
I know. Kudos to you. I was not thinking about this early.
Yeah, I know exactly. Yeah, the brands that matter to me in middle school were like mostly cartoons and sports teams logos.
I was watching The Breakfast Club. So.
Actually, I should have mentioned, a couple people mentioned the power of branding, that, certain movies are timeless and their brand carries on. Hey, last one, because we're a little bit over time here. Reminder for everyone, lots of events like these coming up all summer long. If you're a Varsity Tutors Learning member, all the recordings of all these events we've done are in your student account, so you can check those out. And there's small group classes, test prep classes, all those kind of things for you. But I've been highlighting all these other classes. Joanna, you're back next month to talk about the admissions interview because you have a lot of experience as an admissions interviewer. Can you give us a sneak preview of what we can expect when you're back in August?
Absolutely. No, so I'll be back next month talking a little bit about the role of the admissions interview, but also more importantly, how to prepare. And again, this is really just a further extension of personal branding. Not every school, and I should say, not every school requires them, not every school offers them, but for the schools that do, it is really important to make sure that you are prepping in a very school specific way for those interviews. So I'll break down what the interview process looks like at a couple of highly selective universities, and we'll run through question types, what you can do to prepare, and give everyone just a primer on the power and importance of interviewing. And again, hint, these skills are going to be skills that will serve you well, whether it be preparing for college or applying for internships or for that first or second job as well. So excited to connect with folks next month for that session as well.
My brand is Guy who forgets to unmute. We're excited to have you back. So thank you so much for such great information today, and in advance for kind of an extension of the brand, right? You need to make sure that that you're getting yourself across. Never get a second chance to make a first impression. So that interview will be really helpful as well. So excited to have you back for that. I was gonna say all of you guys back for that. Such amazing questions today. Thanks to all of you who asked them. If you didn't get them answered, like I said, all kinds of opportunities all summer long to make sure you get the personalized advice you need. And so with that in mind, I'm going to leave you guys with some information about some of the summer programming going on around college admissions, personal branding, and everything else with Varsity Tutors. We'd love to see you guys back here for upcoming events in the StarCourse series, for some of these small group classes on test prep, on college application essays, on financial aid, about choosing colleges and all those kind of things. So plenty of reasons here to see everybody back here soon. So we look forward to it. Thanks, everybody.